Well, hey everyone. Welcome to Awesome Inc. today. Really excited to have Wei-Keat Kong from APAX Software talking with us about web accessibility. Quick introduction for a few folks in the room. I think I've met all of you, but I'm Nick Such, I'm the director of Awesome Inc. U. The room we're in right now is the classroom for our web developer bootcamp. So if you're a bootcamp student, could you raise your hands here?
We're all surrounded.
All right, very cool. Next quick poll, if you're a bootcamp alum, could you raise? I know we've got two here. And if you've been a bootcamp instructor, I think we've got a couple. All right, a few others there. Very cool. So we're really excited that Wei-Keat's going to share a little bit of depth into a topic that we have not otherwise gotten into in this program. Also, a few special guests here with us from UK. If you guys say a quick hello. Hello. So, do you all have any? I guess we've got about an hour that we're gonna.
It won't take an hour, but
very cool.
Questions.
Cool, and I think we've got Keith on the wire. Anyone else there online?
Dave is on the wire.
Hi, Keith. Hi, Dave. Make a little hello from them.
Yeah.
Cool. So we'll be recording this as well, and you've got a presentation. So, so if anyone needs to take a look at this afterwards, we should have all of it on video and the slides. No else to announce. Wei-Keat, floor is yours.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Again, my name is Wei-Keat Kong, and I'm a senior software developer at APAX. So before I start, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. So I graduated with a computer science degree at UK, 98. Since then, I've been working in the software industry, most of it at Lexmark, and here at APAX, probably like 1.5 years now. So during that time at Lexmark, I worked on my master's and my PhD in computer science, and at UK. So, and doing that part time while working at Lexmark. So during my time at Lexmark, I worked on a number of software projects that have Section 508 requirements, and also at APAX now we have the UK Fifth Face-Off project also has Section 508. So web accessibility, Section 508, WGAC 2.0. You may not be familiar with these terms today, but after today, you'll come away with a better understanding of this topic and how it affects the way you write software. So as Nick said, we'll have the slides available after the presentation. It has links to resources that you can look at in more detail after the presentation. All right, so what is web accessibility? So it means that people with disabilities can use the web. Specifically, they can perceive it, they can navigate it, they can understand, interact with, and contribute to the web. So most websites today have some form of barrier to people with disabilities. So if we make websites more accessible, it means more people can use it and more can contribute to the web. So it also benefits people without disabilities. When you have accessible websites, it allows people to be able to customize it and to make it flexible for their needs. For example, if you have like a temporary disability, like if you broke your hand, having an accessible website definitely will help you to be able to still perform your duties there. So the web's a pretty important aspect in our daily lives now. Everyone's on the web today. So it's important that we have equal opportunity, equal access and equal opportunity for everyone to use the web. So for the people with disabilities, this means that they can more actively participate in society. So with the web, you can have unprecedented access to information. You can consume print, audio, visual. They're more easily overcome with web technology. And in some cases, it's actually required by law and policies, so which we'll cover that in a minute. So why is it important? So the next part here, we'll consider some of the issues that people with disabilities face when they try to access the web. So we'll go through a few scenarios and try to understand what they go through. So for first scenario, we'll we'll try to go to, so imagine going to your favorite website and close your eyes and try to navigate the website that you're on and try to be able to use your website. So imagine if you're blind and you want to still be able to, or if you have a temporary blindness, that you want to be able to still be able to use the website. Or for example, let's say you want to watch Netflix or YouTube, turn off your speakers. That's imagining if you're deaf, how would you be able to still watch your favorite show? Or if you know someone with a speech disability and you have a website, but they only offer phone numbers for you to contact them. So, or for example, if you have a relative with ADHD or dyslexia, and they're trying to navigate a complex website, you have lots of video, animation, long passages of text, navigation options at top, side, bottom. Imagine them trying to be able to just use the site to do what they want. So you might not be able to experience any of these situations, but one thing we all will experience is we all age at some point, and we might experience temporary disability. So hopefully you understand how this is an important issue for us to consider as we use the web every day. So how do people with disabilities overcome these barriers? So we have a number of accessibility tools that are available to these people through the OS and through various software that people write. So for example, you have screen readers that can read text to you. You have text magnifiers that can enlarge text for those with low vision. And then you can have like high contrast displays where you'll change the colors on your screen to make it more, make text more visible to people. And then for the blind, you can have braille readers. So you can have a little device on your laptop or computer that actually reads text on the screen and converts it to braille. So these are kinds of accessibility tools that are available. So for today's presentation, we'll talk about what is Section 508 and the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We'll go over specifically the WCAG 2.0. Has 4 principles. The WCAG 12 guidelines under each of those, and each guideline has a number of trustable success criteria. For this, in the interest of time, we won't go over each of the success criteria, but you can refer to them after the presentation. But also, the best practices that we talk about in the presentation will actually help you meet those criteria. So you get a feel of how you're going to be able to meet the criteria by looking at the best practices. We'll also look at how you evaluate accessibility, looking at various tools and procedures you can use. Yeah. And then at the end, we'll have some questions. But feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I'll try my best to answer them. All right. All right, so what is Section 508? So it's specifically the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So you can look it up. It basically directs federal agencies to provide equal access, comparable access to disabled employees and to the public. So in 1998, they amended it to include websites, electronic documents, and software. And actually, earlier this year, it was refreshed again to harmonize the requirements with other guidelines and standards that have been produced more recently. So one of these is the WCAG 2.0, and it was produced by the W3C, and is actually an ISO standard. And it explains how to make web content accessible to people with disabilities. So this standard is targeted at developers, web developers, but it's also for those who want a standard for web accessibility. And it also covers mobile accessibility. So we'll talk a little bit about how this applies to mobile devices and the small mobile devices. So among the supporting documents that are in the WCAG is obviously it's a checklist of things that you do to meet the the success criteria. It covers techniques to how to achieve that to meet the success criteria, and also guidance. So it's a lot of supporting documents to help you understand and be able to meet the standard. So the WGAC has 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So these are the 4 principles of the WGAC. We'll go over each of them in detail. And there's a number of guidelines under each of those. And then under each guideline, there's a success criteria. So there's 3 different compliance levels: A, AA, AAA. And then so some of these guidelines only have like an A or AA. Some have an AAA. So you don't have there's 3 levels there. You don't have, not all websites have to meet like AAA. So how does the WGAC 2.0 relate to Section 508? So as of the latest refresh, so if you have compliance with the WGAC AA, it satisfies Section 508 requirements. So goal would be to shoot for AA, but if you can do any of the AAA, that will make it more accessible. So the first principle, perceivable, states that information and user interface components must be presentable in ways they can perceive. So the intent behind this principle is that you must be able to perceive the information being presented. So it means you can't be invisible to your senses. So the first guideline says it provide text alternatives for all non-text content. So electronic text is actually presentation neutral. So you can present it in any other form that meets your need. So you can enlarge text, it can be spoken aloud, or it can be rendered in tactile form like Braille. So it's pretty versatile. So providing text alternatives for the non-text content will make it more accessible to people with disabilities. The second guideline is to provide synchronized alternatives for multimedia. So multimedia meaning audio, video, either pre-recorded or live streams. So the way you can meet this guideline is to provide audio transcripts, video captions, audio descriptions of what's going on in a video, or even sign language. So the third guideline is to create content that can be presented in different ways without losing information or structure. So this means that you want to keep your content independent from your presentation. So users can take that content, change it to whatever form that they need to be able to understand it. So you want to make sure your content doesn't rely solely on shape, size, location, orientation, or sound. And then the fourth guideline is to make it easy to distinguish between the foreground information and background information. So this means, like for visual, you want to make sure your text has sufficient contrast. You're not using color to be the sole means of communicating information. You want to be able to resize the text. The user needs to be able to resize the text. In terms of audio, you want to be able to control the volume, control playback of video. So these are examples of things that you need to be able to do to meet the guidelines. So second principle is operable. The user interface components and navigation must be operable. So the intent here is that if you can achieve all the functionality on your website using the keyboard, then any user, either just a regular user, anyone that's using speech input, using a mouse, or using some sort of accessibility tool can use your site just by simulating keystrokes. So the guideline here is to make sure you can have all functionality operable with the keyboard interface. So specifically, don't require specific timing of keystrokes. So you don't have them. You can't do that. You shouldn't have them be able to complete something within a certain amount of time. So users must be given enough time to enter the keys to use your site. It's important that when you're using the keyboard to not have what we call keyboard traps. So as they're using the keyboard to navigate your site, and then they get stuck and they can't get out of it, of that location on the site. So that's not a very good state to be in. So the second guideline is to allow users more time to do their reading or to interact with the site. So definitely users with disabilities, they need more time to complete the task. So you want to be able to provide them ways to adjust timing of any content, moving content, be able to pause, stop, or any of those kind of active controls that move, they blink, they scroll, or anything that auto updates. You want to they'll give them the control to pause that. Third guideline is to allow users to avoid content that could cause seizures. So there's a case in Japan years ago where like 700 kids went to seizures when they watched the Pokemon. So and that caused a big problem for Nintendo. And so this is why we have that guideline here, is to make sure you don't have flashing content, or you limit the flashing content to less than 3 flashes a second. So the fourth one is provide mechanisms to help users find content, orient themselves, and navigate through it. So make sure they can easily recognize navigation bars, page headers, and allow them to be able to skip that. So for screen readers, they always read sequentially. So you want to be able to have a way for them to skip through all that, since they know what's that, and skip to the main content. You want to make sure your page titles, your labels, headings describe the topic and purpose, so they'll be able to understand where they are on the page. And when you're looking at links, you want to make sure that you describe the link's purpose and not just say read here or click here. So we'll see examples of that when we go through the best practices. So the third principle is understandable. So information and operation of the user interface must be understandable. So the intent here is that users must be able to understand the information as well as the operation of your user interface. So first guideline is to make text content readable and understandable. So people with disabilities, they experience text in different ways: visual, auditory, tactile, combination of this. Some people have difficulty understanding written word, but when it's spoken, they can understand more complex documents. So problem with this is some accessibility tools might not be able to present the text correctly unless it knows what language it is and what direction it's supposed to read from. So you want to make sure that your web page indicate what language the page is in, and if you have blocks of text that are in a different language, you want to tag it so that the accessibility tools know how to pronounce the words there. One of the things that the guideline recommends is to make sure your text reading level is no higher than 9th grade, so that a lot more people can understand the content. And then so the second guideline is to make placement and functionality of content predictable. So by putting all your content across your pages in predictable order, then people will be able to figure out what's the fastest way they can get to their task using the fewest keystrokes. So the third guideline is to help users avoid mistakes and make it easy to correct mistakes that do occur. So you want to be able to let users know when there's an error in their input, give them instructions on how they can fix it, or suggest ways that they can fix it. Fourth principle is robust, and this is one guideline here. It says content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. So user agents here means browsers, anything that consumes web content. The guideline says support compatibility with current and future user agents using assistive technologies. So how do we do that? You do that by making sure your markup is well-formed, HTML, XHTML, whatever technology you're using. Make sure you expose information in standard ways. This principle relates more to custom UI components. So if you're creating a custom UI component using some combination of HTML elements, you want to make sure you support accessibility for that. So making sure that you tag it with the right IDs, handle some of the events when users interact with it. So nice thing about standard HTMLs, if they all already meet this guideline. So this applies more to custom UI components. All right, so the next set of slides, we'll talk about some of the web accessibility best practices. So we'll talk about them in various groups. They're divided by role. So like when you're designing for web accessibility, this relates more to UI designers. So UI designers will definitely benefit from that. When you're writing for web accessibility, it pertains more to like content writers, people who write actual content for websites, the best practices for that. And then for software developers, when you're developing for web accessibility, we'll look at some of the best practices there. We'll also look at mobile accessibility. So some of the things that you need to consider when you're developing for a mobile device. So some pictures there. So finally get some pictures. So the first thing is to make sure that you have sufficient contrast between your foreground and background. So you see an example there. You have on the left side the text with gray text with a beige background. It's a little hard to see. So you want to make sure you have sufficient contrast so that people can read them. This applies to anything that's text that's on images, any background, gradients, buttons, any other elements that has text on it. That doesn't apply to logos or any incidental text, like if text happens to be in the photograph, you don't need to make sure those have contrast. Don't use colors alone to convey information. So don't say that required fields are in red. Someone who can't perceive red won't be able to see which fields are red. So you want to use some other form to indicate the information there. So like an asterisk. An asterisk is very commonly used in combination. So you can see the red, and also people that can't perceive red can look for the asterisks. Also, when you're looking at shapes, or charts, you want to use labels on your charts, so you can people can have an alternative way to identify the charts. So when you're working with interactive elements, you want to make sure you can easily identify them, like links. Whenever you hover over them, make sure that they change their style. When you use your keyboard to focus on them, that they change, or when you touch or click it, that actually has some interaction that they can see.
Hey, Wei-Keat.
Yeah.
So is there, I mean, with the internet, like links are inevitable, right? You're going to go away from your page. Is there any sort of standard for like indicating that, hey, this thing doesn't navigate within this app, it navigates somewhere else?
Okay. So the question was, is there some way to indicate on a link that you're about to go to an external site?
I guess, is that like part of the compliance, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yes, there are some best practices there. So when you do have a link that goes to an external site, you can add some text that for screen readers that can tell you that this link will go to an external site. So that's one of the ways you can do that. For screen readers, as they're navigating links, they'll read the link and say that it goes to an external site. All right, so the next best practice is to make sure you have clear and consistent navigation on your site. So make sure that across all your pages you have consistent naming, styling, positioning, and have more than one way to use your website. So for example, like if you have a site search, where you can locate specific types of pages. So you want to look for a customer service page, you can just type it in the search page, the search bar. or if you want to use a sitemap to basically just have a page of links that you can use instead of trying to navigate the actual site. And help users to understand where they are on the page using breadcrumbs so they can see as they progress on the page where they are. And also like headings, use headings to indicate where they are on the site. For elements, form elements, make sure your labels are close to your fields, just so that they can see the relationship between the label and the field, and avoid having too much space between them. When you're using feedback on the forms, you can provide either a confirmation page, or you could alert a user when something happens and tell them like what fields are incomplete, or there are errors in the field, and letting users know what changed on the page. Things like that, using feedback to tell users what happened.
On form error handling, is there specific like tags or something that a screen reader would help a screen reader jump to, like the email address is incorrect, help somebody that's only using a screen reader fix validation errors essentially?
Yeah. So the question is, are there any ways for accessibility in accessibility to be able to indicate that there's an error on your form submission and where it is? Yes, there are a number of attributes you can add to the HTML elements. They're called the ARIA elements, A-R-I-A, and you can attach those. And then whenever there's an input error, the screen reader will be able to detect that and read that to the user and tell them that there's an error on this field. And you need to also make sure you describe those errors properly so that the users will be able to know how to fix those errors.
Okay.
All right. So the next best practice is to use your headings and your spacings. So make sure you organize them well to make the relationships between your content more apparent. This is more for like when you have a lot of content that you want to organize, and then you have just categories, and you can make sure you organize those so they are easier. It's easier to navigate, to scan it and to understand it. So you want to consider how information is presented in the different size devices. So like on a big screen versus on a mobile phone. With technology today, you can use what we call responsive design. So the site will reflow to match your device. So as if you have a bigger screen, you have more of the content visible, and then when you go down to a mobile device, it'll only show you more important pieces of the site here. Make sure you want to, on smaller devices, that the text is enlarged slightly so that you can actually read them. So for images and videos, you want to make sure you have alternatives for them. For example, like in this picture here, you have a video, and then you also have a link to a transcript, and also like an alternative video description for the video. Make sure, and when you have when you have tables or complex graphs, you want to make sure your captions are descriptive, and that the tables when the screen reader reads the tables, you'll be able to read it users will be able to understand what the table is about. When you have controls that have animations like videos and carousels, you want to give the user the capability to stop animations and play, and then be able to control that. So the next section is our best practices for writing for the web's accessibility. So this deals mainly with what you actually read on the site. So first thing is to make sure your page titles are well done. So there are some sites that just have one page title for all the pages, and you can't tell what page you're on when you're looking at it. So making sure your page titles are describe the page content. Make sure it's different from your other pages. Also, you want to put your more unique or relevant information in the title itself. So you can have the page, if you have, for example, here you have the organization as the homepage title, and then when you're on a page, you have the page name and then the company name. And then if you have a multi-step process, you want to have your step, the step you're on in the title as well, so they know which step they're on when they're looking at a page.
Wei-Keat, I noticed in there they use, it's like a bullet for a separator. Are there any considerations for separators versus, vertical bar, hyphen?
So the question is, are there any best practices for separators in just titles or anywhere on the site?
Titles primarily, but everywhere else.
Okay, titles. I've seen various uses of it. I think it's important to make sure that the screen reader reads it correctly. So when you do use particular separators, you make sure you test it with the screen reader to make sure that it reads appropriately. If it doesn't read that well, then you might want to consider changing that separator.
So run it through that test.
Right, yeah. So part of all this is to make sure that the accessibility tools are reading your content correctly. So.
Are there certain characters that screeners just don't announce? Like the dot, like the bullet.
Let's see. The question is, are there any characters that screen readers don't announce? That's a good question. I've never.
Smiley face in there? They do not.
A smiley face, yeah, it won't read smiley face.
So there's a bunch of Unicode that's just like, I'm not going to try.
Yeah, anything that's not printable, I would assume that the screen reader won't read. There's also ways to tell the screen reader not to read this. So if there are page elements that are just decorative, you can tell the screen reader, hey, this is just decorative, don't read this. For example, like the horizontal lines, HR elements, you can tell screen reader to just ignore this. Or if you have a div that has some fancy characters in it, and it's just decorative, or some image, then you can just tell the screen reader to ignore it.
About glyphs and special characters?
What about glyphs and special characters?
Is there ever an issue with screen reader treatment?
I think you have to evaluate it on a case by case to see if the glyph is important to the content, then you can tag it with a descriptive text, so the screen reader will be able to read what you intended to read instead of the glyph. It could be company symbol or something like that.
How uniform are different screen readers?
So the question is, how uniform are different screen readers?
Will they all interpret things the same way?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, no. So there are a number of built-in screen readers available. So Microsoft has the narrator, Mac has what do you call it? I can't remember. Okay, yeah, I don't have a Mac, so I don't remember what the name of it is. But so those are the two built-in ones that the OS provides, and they're pretty decent. There's JAWS, which is a commercial company that sells screen readers. Pretty expensive, a few $1,000s for a license. So yeah, it's money to be made in this industry, but it's very niche, unfortunately. That's why they command such a high price for that. And there's some open source one, NVIDIA, not the video game company. And they are an open source screen reader as well. So unfortunately, they don't all read content the same way. So my best recommendation is make sure you test with at least two. So Mac and Windows would be a good one. If you have access to JAWS or NVDA, you can try to run it through that and see to make sure that overall it reads most of your content. There's a lot of controls in the screen readers that you can tell it like how verbose you want it to be. It'll read every single element it finds, or it tries to read it more intelligently and just focus on the content. So a lot of testing goes into making sure that the screen readers read content properly. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think headings, making sure that your headings are short and they group your paragraphs together and clearly describe your sections. So talking about link text, so here's an example of this. It says if you read it, for more example on device independence, click here. So for a person that's looking at the site, sure, that looks fine, but to a screen reader, all it says is click here. So you want to be able to describe what the link does. So you can have the text be about device independence, and it's a link to a different page. And you can add additional descriptive labels to the link to tell them what it does. Especially if you're linking to documents, you can tell them that this is a link to a PDF, and it's like 20 megs, something like that, before they go click on that. So there's things you can do under the covers to help screen readers to describe things more clearly to users. So regarding text alternatives, you want to make sure that you write the alternative text that provides the information or the function of the image. So for example here, like the image here, the alternative text here says charging phone. And that's the picture of a charging phone. That doesn't help someone who's actually trying to learn how to charge their phone. So a more appropriate alternative text is to say plug cable into the bottom edge of the phone. So it's more descriptive. Make sure you kind of think about it that way. It's how the person that's not able to see the image be able to understand what the image is about. So for audio content, like podcasts, make sure you have like a transcript, someone that can just read the text. And then for like videos, have captions.
I was using this just yesterday because we're having to make our videos compliant with transcripts. And we're using a third-party software that Vimeo suggests. And the suggestion in there, and I'm not sure if it was a suggestion or it's part of compliance, but it was no more than a 42-character limit per line of text. Do you know anything about that for that? And so instead of like showing one big kind of long run sentence or half of a sentence, it's only 42 characters, and then you go to the next one.
Yeah, so the question is whether there's a specific guideline for captions to be like limited to a certain length. I'm not aware of a character limit for that. I think it's more for the readability of the text. So if you have a lot of text on the screen and you're looking at a video, and the text you have like 5 lines of text, you probably might not read all of it by the time it goes to the next scene.
Is that really limiting the sentence or just the line of text? Like, could you split up a sentence to like 42, maximum 42 character length lines, I guess?
So the question is, yeah. Yeah, the question is whether you can split the lines of text into multiple 42 character lines. I think with videos, you only have a limited amount of space for caption. So if you watch the news, there's only like probably 3 lines at the bottom of the screen. And I think it's just so that you don't flood the whole screen with text. So they have to be a bit more concise when they do that. Cool. Any other questions on captions? We're good? All right. So the next best practice is to make sure you have clear instructions, guidance, on like error messages, making sure that they're clear, easy to understand, and try to avoid unnecessary technical language. So a user may not be very technical, so you don't want to bombard them with all sorts of technical terms. Also, you can help them by describing their input requirements, such as date format. So if you ask them to enter a date, if you suggest like, hey, use month, day, year, that will help them to be able to input it correctly the first time. So you want to make sure you use simple language formatting as appropriate for your context. For example, here you have a big long paragraph that describes a process. And then the right part is a more concise, easier to understand set with bullets and pictures to help a user understand the process. So yeah, so make sure you consider using the visual bullets, the images to be able to convey your information. So the third section we're talking about for best practices is developing for web accessibility. This applies to a lot of people here as you're in the bootcamp. So I want to make sure that your labels are associated with your fields. So here you have a label and a field. You want to use some attributes that associate the label with the field. So there's like the for attribute and the ID attribute. So screen readers will be able to tell this label associated with this field.
Is there a problem with, I know a decent amount in the past at least, I'll wrap the input label or the input with the label tag instead of using the for and ID. Is that bad for accessibility, or is that acceptable? Or
So the question is whether wrapping the field with the input, field with the label, or
yeah,
is it?
So like you can get the same behavior as like when you click on the label, it focuses the input by wrapping it with the label tag as you do with the for and the ID. But I don't know if that's like portable accessibility or not.
Yeah, I think that might cause issues for accessibility when you do that, when you wrap the field with a label.
Okay.
So I would test it with a screen reader to make sure you can that it actually reads correctly. And then, but the best practice is to have the for and ID so that the screen readers can read that. Anytime you diverge from the standard, the HTML standard, it creates issues. You have to implement accessibility yourself. So that's why we recommend to go with standard HTML, the nesting of elements. So that gives you accessibility out of the box. So when you diverge from that, you'll have to do a lot more testing and implement a lot of the other accessibility features. Yeah, it might look easy and fancy in the first time, but when you do get hit with accessibility requirements, it causes you to rethink that. Whoa. Okay, so next one is go away. Alternative text for images. So instead of saying picture for student, actually describe what the image is about. So, so if you have decorative images, like I said, just making sure you just have the empty alternate text will be fine.
Are there times that you notice that building for web accessibility also ends up scenarios where SEO is important? Are you kind of accomplishing two goals at the same time?
The question is whether building for accessibility helps SEO. I'm not too sure about that. I haven't done a whole lot with SEO. There's definitely information you can put, like meta information you can put on the page that helps SEO, and that is usually not read by the screen reader. So that's meta information. Okay, so talking about page language and language changes, we talked about it earlier, just tagging your HTML page with the language of the page, and then if there's a particular section that's in a different language, the screen reader will be able to pronounce it correctly. Okay, then using markup to convey meaning. So the HTML5 now has a number of new elements that you can use that's semantic in nature. So you have the navs, the sides, You have a number of roles that you can add to it to tell screen readers and accessibility tools more of the meaning behind the structure. Helping users avoid mistakes, correct mistakes, making sure you have clear instructions, error messages, and notifications to help them find where the problem is. This one's interesting, reflecting the reading order. So visually it looks in order. You read them, you look at the page, okay, there's a shoe there, and then there's this description. You want to make sure that when the screen reader reads it, that it reads it in order. One of the ways you can do this is actually take out all the CSS styling, and then you look at the content and make sure that it's still reading it in the correct order. So for example, here the image is outside above the H3 tag, so you don't actually know if the screen reader won't know that the image is really is under the H3. So that's that. Using responsive design, so whenever the user's viewport change using a different device, that it automatically adjusts to the screen size. When you're using non-standard controls like divs, and you make sure you have like the area, ARIA, which we won't cover today. It's a big topic there where you can look at it, but it's a whole different presentation there. Adding those attributes will make the screen readers be able to understand what that set of elements are. Making sure that your custom elements are keyboard accessible. So making sure that when you use your keyboard, that you can actually interact with it correctly. So this is with like custom controls. So just using the keyboard, using the screen reader, making sure that those custom controls are working correctly. All right, so capture is a pretty neat thing to detect if you're a robot or not. Unfortunately, the first version of it was pretty bad. Regular people had problems using it, so it's even worse for people with disabilities. So the newer version is called the no capture reCAPTCHA. It's just a checkbox that you just click on it, or if you use a keyboard, you just tab to it and just hit the space, and it'll try to detect if you're a robot or not. So it's a lot more accessible. So make sure you use the reCAPTCHA instead of the old captures. I still see old captures all over in like different sites, and it's always really hard to tell what's in the capture. But I like the new ones. All right, so talking about mobile accessibility, these are things that you want to consider when you're developing for mobile devices. So we'll talk about it based on each of the principles. So the first principle, perceivable. Since you have a small screen size, you want to make sure you minimize the information on this page. Use your responsive design. You can either use a mobile-specific version of your site, or you can use responsive design and re-render the site differently. Making sure that your touch targets are big enough so people with fat fingers can actually hit the buttons, and that your texts are big enough that they can actually read them. So allowing your users to be able to zoom into your site is also pretty important on mobile devices. So when they're looking at a small device, they want to be able to just pinch zoom and focus on specific content. Making sure you have good contrast of colors on the site is pretty important on a small device as well. Especially if you're outdoors, you want to make sure you have good contrast so you can actually read the content. So under the operable principle, believe it or not, some people actually use keyboards with their mobile device. Not by choice, but out of necessity, and they can either use an on-screen keyboard or a Bluetooth keyboard. So that's you want to make sure that your site can still be used on a mobile device with a keyboard. Again, looking at touch target size, making sure it's big enough so that they can hit it, and also making sure that if it's like the minimum is recommended is about 9 millimeters by 9 millimeters. So making sure if your touch targets are around that size, make sure you have some inactive space around it so that you don't have them accidentally hitting targets that are close to each other. So if you have touchscreen gestures, you want to make sure that they're easy to use, and then actually be able to indicate to the user that these gestures are available on your site. some sites, mobile apps have device manipulation gestures, like if you shake it or you tilt it. Having an alternative for that on the screen enables disabled users to be able to use those features as well. And button placements as well, especially with the bigger phones, making sure that you position your elements somewhere where they can reach with your fingers. Looking at understandable principle, you want to consider mobile devices can switch orientation. You want to be able to handle that whenever users switch orientation. And then making sure you have consistent layout across the pages. Although users can zoom, you want to make sure that they can. You want to make sure that they don't have to zoom to your content. That you put your content at the top, near the top of the page, so that they can just read the content and don't have to scroll down or zoom in to look at your content. Looking at elements that have the same action, like if you have on the big screen you have multiple links that go to the same page, like that goes home. On the mobile device, you don't really need so many, and when you're using the keyboard, you don't want to always have to skip through those because they all do the same thing. So grouping them into a single control will help users that have to navigate those controls all the time before they reach the content. So if you have custom gestures for your device, you want to be able to tell the users how to use them. So having some kind of overlay tooltip or tutorial to explain how to use those gestures, and you need to make sure that users can be able to refer back to it, and you can, so they can read about it again. The last principle there is robust, so you can use the HTML input type to indicate what kind of input the field accepts. So like numbers or password fields, there are a number of input types that you can associate with the input field. And on a mobile device, it will actually show you a different keyboard based on your input. And you want to reduce data entry on a mobile device, so reduce the amount of typing that people have to do. You can do that having select menus, radio buttons, checkboxes, or auto-filling information ahead of time. And mobile devices actually have some accessibility features, like the support for accessibility. You want to make sure that those work for your site as well. All right. So last part is talking about how you evaluate accessibility. So there are a number of things you can do, and I'll have the links here. You can always go to the site and they'll explain in detail how to do that. The first one is Easy Checks. It's on the W3C site. It's a basic checklist of things you can do just to quickly evaluate the site to see how accessible it is. If you want a more formal procedure, there's the WGAC evaluation methodology. It's also on that site. It's a common procedure for evaluating, auditing websites. It's for like internal evaluators, auditors, managers can refer to it. If you're procuring software, you can reference that methodology. So that's a formal procedure. Basically, the procedure is you define the scope of your evaluation, you set your evaluation goals and what conformance level to achieve, and then you identify which pages you want to look at. Some sites have a lot of pages, so you could select a sample of it, the representative sample, like a couple of different types of content on the site, and then basically you do the evaluation, and then if there's like a checklist you fill out, and then you report your findings. So that's in short the methodology for WCAG EM. Another thing you can do is actually involve users. So you're doing user testing, and that can range from just a brief consultation with people that have some form of disability, to have them come in and use your site for a while and just tell them like, hey, try to do this on our site, and then observe them, how they interact with the site, and then just have a discussion on how they feel about using your site and what could be improved. You could go up to the other end of the spectrum and look at large-scale usability studies, where you actually pay people to come in to use your software, and you've got video set up and a special room that you can observe behind two-way mirror, and you can look at them. Actually, you record them and you play back and do analysis there. But that's the other end of the spectrum. Lexmark does that all the time with their products. So they'll have usability studies. So people come in and use their printers, use the software, look at that. So they'll have established protocols. You have to follow it by the book. You gather quantitative, qualitative data. Quantitative, you'll have them perform series of steps. You kind of check off as they do it. And then there's like survey at the end. You ask them some qualitative questions, and they kind of give you that feedback. And use that to make improvements to your software. So those are the two extremes of the usability testing we do. There are also a number of tools available online. So the W3C, everything's on the W3C. There's a lot of things you can find on that site. But there are a number of tools you can use there. There are HTML validators. There are tools that can check your color contrast on your page to identify elements that have low contrast with the background. There's some audit tools that you can run that will just go through your site and flag, hey, these are not meeting the criteria or this guideline, and so on and so forth. There's also plugins that can simulate low vision impairment. So you just install the plugin on there, you bring up your website, you pick which type of visual impairment you want, like blurry vision, color blindness, and they'll adjust your page to reflect how a vision impaired person would perceive your site. There's a lot of tools on there, just a sampling of them. When you do start looking into evaluating accessibility, you'll just kind of evaluate the tools and see which ones you can use, which ones will help you do your test evaluation. So what did we talk about today? So we talked about what is web accessibility. We talked about what is Section 508 and the WGAC 2.0. We looked at the four principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. There are guidelines under each of those, and success criteria under each guideline. We didn't go through success criteria. That's a whole more in-depth presentation there. But we looked at best practices, which helps to meet the success criteria. We looked at how do you evaluate accessibility. So I hope today's presentation has been helpful to you. I hope you'll be able to use some of these best practices on your next project. So here we'll have a number of resources you can go back and look and review in more detail later on. And now I'll open up for questions. All right, Chris.
Yeah, so it sounded like the evaluation aspect of things, it unfortunately seems like the nature of the beast is that you have to have a lot of humans evaluating it. So like, I guess my question is like, how much of this do you think could be unit testable, and how much of it is you have to actually have someone look at it and touch it and or not, or hear it or see it?
So the question is, how automatable is accessibility
Yeah,
testing?
has anyone like taken a stab at like trying to like, here's this gauntlet you can run your web app through, and out comes a grade of 508?
There are certain aspects of the accessibility testing that can be automated. Like I said, there are a number of tools. Yeah, there are a number of tools that are available out there that will do some of the testing for you, like contrast checking. Instead of locating all the individual colors and running them through a contrast checker, the tool actually goes in and finds all the elements and does the checking for you.
Yeah,
So
I googled it when you started talking about it with the reading level. So like, it seems like a fairly easy thing to just
yeah, the
like,
reading level.
throw some
Yeah.
text at an API and say what grading level is this?
Yeah. So there is a formula for that, the Flash Kincaid, and that'll tell when you run your text through that, it'll tell you what the grade level is.
I guess I was just curious if anyone's taken a stab
Yeah, there's some parts of it that's definitely automatable. Unfortunately, there's still that human element there with being able to perceive that the accessibility of the site. So at some point, you still have to have actual users using the site to actually give you that feedback that whether this is usable or not. Yeah, it's not something that's easily automatable. Even if it is, it's probably going to be expensive to maintain. So the thing with automation is that it breaks. You have to maintain it. So there's a cost-benefit trade-off you have to consider. Is like, how much money do I want to spend automating this? Yeah, or I can hire a bunch of people over.
In general are kind of the same thing, right? Like, well,
Yeah.
eventually you write code that your unit tests, you break the unit test, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
same principle.
Matt.
Just out of curiosity, now that you've been implementing Section 508 compliance for a while now, what's your like dev process with that? Like, what do you go through to test your stuff that you're implementing?
So the question is, what's my dev process for implementing like software projects and considering accessibility? So first is making sure that you avoid using custom elements, custom controls, as much as possible, because it just creates more work for you because you have to implement all the accessibility yourself. Sometimes in a hurry you just slap on a bunch of elements and call it done, and then you don't have it appropriately tagged with IDs and the fors and some of those things. So just being more aware of those best practices definitely will help, rather than going back later and trying to address that. So for the more recent example is Face Off. We when we first started that project, we didn't have a 508 requirement, fixed 508 requirement for that. It was so the thing with adding that with having 508 requirements is it does add cost to your project, because you have to do the additional testing, making sure that it's accessible. Screen readers are a pain to work with sometimes. They don't read what you want them to read. So a lot of time it's just manually going through and making sure that it's reading it correctly.
What would you say the biggest amount of, like the biggest chunk of work for Face Off, for example, like that you had to do to get over the hump?
Oh, for accessibility?
Yeah.
For accessibility, I think just in general getting the site navigable and actually having it reading correctly. So
Like correct order.
yeah, in the correct order. So visually it looks correct, but when you do go through with the keyboard, you realize that it's jumping around, or it's not going to where I want it to go, or it's not actually going to. It's actually skipping a whole chunk of the site because there's no interactable element up there. So those kind of things, when you look at it, it's like, oh yeah, I need to think about the design didn't really consider that.
Is JavaScript a problem? Like, are most screen readers smart enough to inspect the DOM at that moment in time and not what was originally rendered on the page?
The question is whether screen readers can figure out if
They
JavaScript.
jive well with JavaScript.
Yeah. Screen readers will only read whatever's rendered.
On
On
the
the-
original initial page?
No, I believe it is on the page load. So I think you're talking about React when things change in
like
React.
A one-page of JavaScript app that just says, here's a div where my app goes, but the initial render of the page is...
Oh yeah, the initial page is rendered, but after that it's the HTML. So when it does refresh, the screen reader will see that,
Okay.
because it does show up in the browser. I mean, the rendered elements do show up in there. So when that happens, the screen reader detects a change in the state and starts reading it again.
Okay, cool.
So, but thing is, when you do that, you want to make sure that the screen readers are notified of the change. So, making sure that, hey, when you do transition states, that the screen readers do detect that and actually read that. So we had some issues with that with Face Off when we were clicking on links and it wasn't actually transitioning right. So yeah, so some of the newer technologies are like client-side technologies, Angular, React, might cause some issues with screen readers. So it's something you have to kind of look at and test with.
So did you do a lot of this testing by just using a screen reader, or did you do a lot by like dumping the CSS and seeing your page order? Or?
So dumping the CSS, I haven't done that. So that was one of the things I looked at when I was doing research. It's like, yeah, that's good practice to kind of do that. But most of it is just trying to just navigate the site with a keyboard. I think if you can navigate the site with the keyboard, I mean, you can achieve quite a lot with accessibility, because you can get to the controls and the screen readers can actually read what's
Like
on the
tab
control.
order, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, tabbing order, yeah, those, getting those right is pretty important.
Okay. Cool.
What have you learned? I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Somebody else
Jenny,
on.
yeah.
Go ahead.
What percentage of websites, out of all of them, do you think are properly formatted for accessibility?
So the question is how many percent of websites are accessible? I don't know. It's a pretty big web out there. If you go to a lot of sites, you'll after going through today's presentation, go back and look at some of the sites that you frequent and see if they're actually accessible. I would tell you that it's probably more than half of them are probably not accessible. You can go to I go to MSN a lot, and there's a lot of content on MSN. So try to use your keyboard on there and use a screen reader and see if you can find your way around that. So the short answer is, yeah, a lot of the sites don't really consider accessibility, or because there's no requirement for it, like the legal requirement for it, other than like when you're working with government contracts. So like if you're working with the federal government or with the state now, UK, all your sites have to be 508 compliant. And then you go back and look and say, oh no, there's a lot of work to do there. So yeah, unfortunately it's something that gets put aside until you actually are required to do something about it.
Does that include mobile as well, or does it just have to be a website to be compliant?
There are things to consider for mobile accessibility. I mean, there's not really a specific requirement that you have to be 508 compliant on a mobile device. But the WGAC has a section for mobile accessibility, so things that you need to consider when you're actually developing for a mobile device. So having responsive design, making sure you display content that's more relevant near the top of the page, those kind of things.
Best practice kind of?
It's kind of guideline best practice for that. I mean, it's still a website or a web app, depending on what you're writing. So if you have that requirement, then yeah, you want to make sure you do that. But otherwise, it's still best practice. I mean, just for regular users to be able to know that when you're on a mobile device, that everything is just kind of pushed aside and you just have your content on there. So I think it just makes it just more pleasurable experience when you design for accessibility.
It's been my experience that more and more the legal is aspect of it, and being sued for compliance is not just government. If you were disabled and you come across a site and you decide to file a lawsuit, you can't. And we have a client that is definitely not government who is being served a lawsuit right now. We had to go back to
Mm.
just for compliance.
Yeah.
And because a lot of lawyers out there, not a lot, but there are many who like to, in the name of someone who is disabled, file a lawsuit and say, in the name of this person who is disabled, we can't use your website. And we're suing you for this amount of money. That's happened very recently, and I believe that's probably going to happen more and more. So the compliance is probably just good practice from now on, regardless of the client.
Yeah.
that end, do you know if what is being maybe brought up as the standard in some of these lawsuits? I know we looked at a compliance issue, and it worked on one browser but not the other. But was one browser good enough? Would that hold up in a lawsuit? And then what? I know this is a very complicated question already. And then if they are going to some governing body that says, okay, you're compliant, is it the W3.org? And then, so if we're compliant there, we're good. We don't have to worry about it. It seems like there's still a lot of things up in the air.
Yeah, so the Section 5.0 requirements just states that you need to give comparable access to disabled employees and public. So that doesn't actually tell you what you need to do. So the WGAC 2.0 is a standard, so it's actually a technical document that tells you exactly how you need to make it accessible. So, and then, like I mentioned earlier, the 2A compliance is what you need to have to meet the Section 508 compliance. So
when would you need to use 3A?
3A is kind of like your nice to haves. You can, some of it you can already, like if you're already at 3A, you can advertise that, hey, for these feature we're at 3A, and it's not expected that they even stated in the on the W3 site that you don't have to meet 3A. It's optional. It just makes it more accessible.
Consider your target audience, like if it's a site for somebody with special needs, or target
There's
audience might do that maybe.
some principles don't have some guidelines don't have 3A requirements. The most they have is 2A. Some only have 1A. So yeah, so not every guideline has the AA, and 3As. So for example, like when you're talking about live video, having alternative media for that, that's a 3A requirement. It's not required for Section 508. It's not easy to implement too. So so that's kind of how it is with that. So to answer your question, to come back to your question, is specifically about browser support, like how many browsers do we need to support? So the fourth principle says is robust, so you need to be able to support as many. But I think you'll have to look at the conformance claim document. There's a document that you produce that that you state your compliance level and any exceptions to that, and then so that's where you document, like, this is what we did with compliance and this is where we are at. So I'm not sure if someone's suing you to saying, hey, it doesn't work on my browser.
But you still had access to, like, say, download Chrome.
Yeah, then you can tell them, hey, you can use Chrome to that.
Or how far back do we know that people
Yeah.
have to go in terms of browser versions?
Yeah. I don't think there's any guidance on like how far back you need to support for that. You have the thing with the WCAG is it's a lot of documentation, and it's not very clear cut in some places. So a lot of it is still kind of open to interpretation. So that's where your statement. We didn't talk about statements here, compliance statements here, but it's the document you produce that's kind of like making your statement about compliance, where you tell them, hey, like, this is what we did, and these are the things that we're compliant with, except for these features or these things. So yeah, so I don't have an answer for you on that one. It's because it's like a lawsuit. Yeah. Talk to the lawyers who debate on the finer things of.
You're just gonna charge me a lot more than you want.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't give you that kind of advice because you get sued and then it's like, oh yeah, then you come around and sue me. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks,
Any
Wei-Keat.
questions? Okay. Thank you. All right. Do I turn this off?
All right, folks. Yeah, thank you all very much for coming in. If anyone has any specific questions, could they stick around?
Yeah,
ask you
I'll
one-on-one?
be around for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And Nick will send out the slides. So make sure you get with him if he doesn't have your email
Or Slack.
or Slack. Yeah.